Well, welcome everybody. This is our regular Healthy Planet Action Coalition meeting that we meet every 2 weeks. And usually most of our meetings have a guest speaker from somewhere around the world to engage in a conversation with us on basically some aspect of what we call the climate triad, and that is emission reductions, large-scale carbon dioxide removal, or direct cooling of the planet. And our guest today is, as you know, is David Spratt. David comes to us from the, as we found out just a few minutes ago, from the beautiful rocky coast, I think you said rocky, of Australia, having your coffee at 7:30 in the morning. We welcome you, David. And I just wanted to say that I think you all, I sent David's brief bio in the notices that I sent out in the last few days. But David has basically been involved with Climate Code Red and the Breakthrough Institute in Australia for quite a few years now, doing really path-breaking reports that sort of go behind the veil, if you will, of what the IPCC and mainstream science does to point out some of the inconvenient facts and trends that are not always, in fact, rarely, if ever, brought to the attention of the public. And before I introduce David, I want to go around briefly, but I want to say one thing first, and that is, I got involved in my local county here, Montgomery County, Maryland, next door to Washington, about 6 years ago, with an effort to get our county to declare the first climate emergency in the United States, which we were successful. But a lot of the information that we used to justify the then unusual, if not alarmist, use of the word emergency came from the publications that David and his colleagues put together back then. And I know, I assume, David, I don't remember exactly, but you were probably connected with Margaret Klein Solomon at the Climate Mobilization, and we were the local chapter. And so we would get, they would send us in the mail packages of your publications, 20, 30 of them, and we'd bring them to our meetings and then use them as the basis for basically educating folks on the reality, or at least another point of view on climate. And I think it's fair to say that if one goes back through the variety of publications that touch on a variety of issues, and you will see that unfortunately, you've been right. We wish you were wrong and that you had overestimated the difficulties, but you've been right. And so you've had an enormous impact on me personally and on our efforts here in Montgomery County, and I'm sure elsewhere in the world. And so I'm delighted to have you here. Well, I've already introduced David. I'm going to simply turn the floor, if that's the right word to use in a Zoom meeting. I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and basically you're going to give a presentation, and then we'll have a informal discussion afterwards.
Thanks very much, Herb, and nice to meet you all. That's great. A couple of months ago, I wrote a piece published by Breakthrough called, I think it was called Faster, Higher, Hotter, What We Learned About Climate Science in 2022, which was just a way of looking back at, what had come out in research and the implications of it. And that has sort of led to a number of meetings, including this one. And 2 days ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists published a piece which they commissioned from me looking at tipping points. So it was called Hotter, Higher, Faster. It could also have been equally called The Case for Cooling, because the science all leads us in that direction. So I'm going to start with a little bit of that science and then get back to a discussion about where I think the climate intervention debate is going. And I think, a lot of that's really positive. So sadly, I'm going to share my screen for a brief period because there are some images that I want to share, and then I'll turn the screen off. Have we got a full screen there, Herb?
Yes.
Excellent. Look, just a little bit of context, as Herb said, just so you know where I'm coming from. A long time ago now, in 2008, I wrote a book with Philip Sutton called Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action, which probably first systematized the idea of climate, of the term climate emergency. And the book basically said three things. The first was that the physical circumstances are worse than the IPCC and most policymakers project, which I think turned out to be sadly true. The second was that 2 degree was the wrong target. This was when there was all that terrible talk about avoiding dangerous anthropogenic influence in the climate system. When we said it should simply be a target of a safe climate, which following Jim Hansen had to be under 0.5 degree. And I think that's more or less proved to be true. And we also said, ironically back then, that required three things, the three levers, the three things that you're on about, which is zero emissions drawdown and geoengineering, and that this required basically a wartime mobilization, which is an idea that many people, including TCM in the US, obviously have picked up. The second thing is a report we did in 2017 called What Lies Beneath the Underestimation of Existential Climate Risk, which was basically a long and detailed critique of the failure of the IPCC to take risks seriously, and how the IPCC was embedded in a culture of failure, caught in the space between science and politics. And in fact, John Schellenhuber, who was then the director of the Potsdam Institute, wrote an introduction to that report, and it actually led people like Schellenhuber and others, I think, to writing a number of papers, including papers on existential risk. And at that time, and in our forward, Schellenhuber said, and I think this is really important in how we communicate the need for climate interventions, when the issue is the survival of civilization, conventional means of analysis, by which he meant the IPCC, may be useless. And I think that's really important. And what he said was, and it was something we pointed out in the report, was that conventional science in the IPCC, sorry folks, is focused on traditional probability analysis. And he said, following us, when risks are existential, you must focus on the plausible worst case outcomes. That's what you've got to stop happening. So he said, in these instances, calculating probabilities makes little sense. Rather, we should identify the high-end possibilities. And that, I guess, is my principal message in communicating the need for climate interventions, because in fact, the high-end possibilities keep on coming true. The principal, I guess, message out of What Lies Beneath was the failure of the IPCC to deal with risk management issues seriously. So classically, and this has become the dominant political narrative out of the IPCC and COP reports, is this idea that you can have a carbon budget with a 33 or 50% chance of failure. You know, so we've got X 100 million tons of CO2 for a 50% chance of 2 degrees. What it's saying is that this budget has a 50% chance of failure, of not keeping to the target. And in fact, a carbon budget with a 50% chance of keeping to 2 degrees actually has a 10% chance of 4 degrees. A 10% chance of 4 degrees, which we know would be civilization ending. And this struck us as absurd, because we don't accept the 10% failure in our private lives, whether it's car seats or buildings or bridges. I mean, the risks of failure we accept in our everyday life are tiny percentages of 1%. And so it was our analysis that incorporating as core business of the IPC risks of failure to the Earth system and to civilization that would be unacceptable in our own lives raise fundamental questions about the efficacy of the IPCC project as a whole. So what I want to do now is just quickly share a few charts that actually came out since we did our Hotter, Higher, Fast report. The first from the US Energy Administration is projected carbon dioxide emissions for the energy sector out to 2050. And as you can see in this chart, in the median case, they're still 80% of what they are today. So net zero 2050 for US energy is actually only a 15 to 20% drop, which is a terrible, terrible failure. And it goes to the wider data and projections of the International Energy Agency of emissions maybe flatlining globally this decade, but essentially plateauing after that and not decreasing further. The second chart is one from Wood Mackenzie in the Financial Times, looking at the world's three largest exporters of LNG, liquid natural gas, being the US, Australia, and Qatar, and looking at their liquefaction capacity, which is their export capacity over the next 10 years. And you can see there that if you add those three numbers together, the export capacity of the three largest gas exporters will double in the next 10 years. So there's no decrease in emissions there. The third is this chart that Jim Hansen put around that other people have seen as well. The grey line is sulfur dioxide emissions from global shipping. You probably know that 3 or 4 years ago there was a new covenant came in which basically banned high sulfur bunker fuel and a drive towards cleaner shipping emissions. So the amount of sulfur dioxide being emitted by the global shipping industry basically went from almost 10 megatons, 11 megatons a year to about 2. And of course, as we know, sulfates, aerosols are a principal agent, a short-term cooling agent in the atmosphere with a very short time frame of longevity of 7 to 10 days. And as soon as you pull aerosols out of the atmosphere, you reduce the cooling mask and temperatures will kick up. So the orange line is essentially the Earth energy imbalance, or they call it absorbed solar radiation anomaly. So this is essentially the energy imbalance at the top of the atmosphere. This is measured for the North Pacific, the North America, and the North Atlantic, which is probably about a quarter or a fifth of the world's surface. And as you can see there, and it's not coincidental, with that drop in sulfate emissions, the Earth's energy imbalance in that part of the Northern Hemisphere essentially went from a half a watt a meter to about 4 watts per meter. And every watt per meter translates to about 3/4 of a degree of warming at equilibrium. So what this has shown, and this is something that Jim Hansen has pointed out to, that over that area of the North Pacific, North America, and North Atlantic, there's been roughly a 3 watts per meter increase in incoming solar radiation, which would translate to more than 2 degrees of warming eventually.
Oh, wow.
2 degrees of warming over a quarter or a fifth of the world's surface, which is about half a degree of warming globally. And this is something that people who read Jim Hansen has been talking about for a long time, what he calls the Faustian bargain of aerosols being reduced. And so if you look at, this is from, I think, Jim's December newsletter, just tracking global temperature, and he points out that we are now starting to get this uptake and an increasing, an accelerating rate of warming. We're about to have a new El Nino, and in fact, March, the month that's just passed, was the hottest March on record. And he says because of continuing high emissions and the reduction in aerosols, due to either less fossil fuel emissions, or in the case of shipping, or in China, cleaning up emissions from coal and bunker oil, he expects warming to double, the rate of warming to double over the next 30 years. So if you look at his chart, in this range, we'll hit 2 degrees around about 2040 to 2050, about 2045. And Jim Hansen is rarely ever wrong, given my experience of him. And lastly, this is just the This is just the March figure, and you can see once again, sorry, the March figure is over 1.5, as it was in these periods back there. So, you know, the idea that 1.5 is a long way away, we've got a carbon budget for 1.5 is mad. Very quickly, and then I'll stop the PowerPoint. So in our faster, higher, hotter report a couple of months ago, we said things which I think are obvious and fairly easy to prove. The first is that emissions may not peak till later this decade and then flatline. Whereas, you know, things like the carbon law say that to have any chance of 2 degrees, you've got to halve emissions between 2020 and 2030. We'll certainly be at 1.5 this decade, maybe before the end of the decade. The third thing is that there's this sleight of hand in IPCC reports and at the COP, because they talk about 1.5 scenarios, but in fact they're overshoot scenarios of going to 2 degrees or more and then getting back by the end of the century with speculative technologies. I mean, particularly things like BECCS. So we are on a path to 2 degrees of warming before mid-century, as Jim's chart shows. A point which is, I think, not well enough understood is that 2 degrees is not a point of system stability. In past climates, it's very rarely reached equilibrium at 2. It tends to go to 3. So because of the feedbacks which are really in play now, and we're really burning by 2 degrees, if you get to 2, as Rockstrom says, you'll get to 3. So we're really on a path of 3 degrees now, which I think, unless there's some amazing political change, is fairly well locked in. The last 3 points we made, that the tipping points are happening faster than forecast. I mean, I keep on seeing papers saying, if we get to 1.5 degrees, there will be tipping points. That's wrong. Tipping points are happening now. I mean, tipping point for coral reefs is probably 0.5 degree. For West Antarctic ice sheet, it's under 1 degree. We now have Jason Box saying there are tipping points past in Greenland. The same is true of Amazon. So the idea that 1.5 is okay is just wrong. The next point is that tipping points are, the risks are cascading and non-linear, which means that they're very difficult to quantify, which means that models which are based on quantification and economic models based on the social cost of carbon probably aren't worth the money the paper they're written on. And that cooling the planet is obviously vital because we're going to overshoot all sorts of targets. So that's where I'm going to finish and get rid of that. Has that disappeared, Herb?
Not yet.
Oh, I've got to stop sharing, don't I? That's better.
Yep.
That's good. So look, I just thought I'd talk a little bit just about the cooling debate, because I think there's some really interesting things happened, and I don't need to talk about the science much more. Let me just find my notes. I think the climate intervention debate is changing, partly because of the physical reality, partly because the risks of what's happening now are better understood, partly because there are more eminent voices in support of climate intervention. I think we're moving to a different ethical debate, and we're now having a debate about climate intervention, which is not just about sulfates, but a wide range of technologies. So, I mean, I think it's really encouraging that we're getting the voices like Sir David King, whose work you know well, and you probably do work with him. A really eminent former chief scientist in the UK who advised 3 UK prime ministers, really leading a climate intervention debate and being really upfront and saying things. He wrote a forward to a report we did a couple of years ago, and he said, what we do in the next 2 or 3 years, and he was talking about Arctic cooling, will determine the future of humanity. So I think that's really helping to change the nature of the debate. You've had people like Jim Hansen saying, yes, we must remove emissions as rapidly as possible, but our target cannot be just minimizing how intolerable the climate becomes. For multiple reasons, we must return to a more propitious, cooler climate, which is fairly explicit. And last year we had some younger scientists in Australia put out a paper saying, in the long term, the best target for global temperature might be something akin to a pre-industrial climate. So I think that's really encouraging. The second thing, which I think is really important for us to do, is that often the debate about climate intervention is about what are the risks of the intervention. But Mike McCracken wrote a really, I think, important paper in 2016 where he said, the ethical analysis has been primarily focused on evaluating the risks and benefits of the intervention rather than as compared to the risks of not acting. And I think that's really our strong point to say, and I say to people, when I debate them here, because most NGOs and activists are not too keen on this stuff, I said, we are now in a place of the least worst outcome. There are no ideal outcomes. And I think interventions are the least worst outcome. The risks of the interventions, of some of them at least, are less than the risks of destroying civilization. So I think that point about the ethical analysis being about the risk of not acting is really important and valuable to us. Mike also makes the point that there hasn't been enough attention to the cost of delay. And he says, if we delay too long in climate interventions, we may lose the capacity to reverse things. If we do it now, for example, in the Arctic, a lot more things can be preserved if we wait 50 years and then try and wind the clock back. And I mean, that's obviously partly because of the better knowledge about the hysteresis of most of these major systems. I mean, it's been pointed out many times that in terms of ice sheets, the path to refreezing an ice sheet is not the same path to its disintegration. So in West Antarctica, and I think it's true more generally, I mean, most of these systems are stable up to 0.5 degree of 1 degree of warming, and then you really start to lose them. But people have said, if you actually want to refreeze them, you probably have to get back to pre-industrial conditions. So, the cost of delay is really important. I think the other thing is coming back to Mike's point, is a debate about the ethics of this. I've written a piece, a sort of a Climate Interventions 101, which has not been published yet. And I talk about the climate movement and what I've called triage politics in climate, where, and it comes back to that discussion and framing of policy making as avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference, where rather than a normative goal of protection, you have this speculation about how hot can it get before something burns? How hot can the saucepan get before the frog dies? So for a quarter of a century, policymakers have speculated about the maximum damage that civilization and the Earth system can tolerate. In other words, and it's still a debate now, how close to the edge of the cliff can we stand without falling off? Is it 1.5? Is it 1.2? This is not a normative goal. It's a really dangerous goal. And the second point to that is that a lot of climate activists have traditionally come from the nature conservation approach, from environment organisations, which is basically a hands-off nature response. But that is no longer appropriate for climate interventions, because the reality is that hands-off will no longer protect nature. Will actually, because of the momentum of the climate system, a hands-off climate interventions attitude will actually destroy nature. So all tools at our disposal must be explored. And I guess the last point, and it's obvious to all of you because this is the work you're involved in, that the debate on climate interventions has moved. Perhaps 10 years ago, it was all about sulfates and planes in the upper atmosphere. Now it's much more diverse. So you've had people like Sir David Attenborough coming out in support of the Arctic initiatives, and Attenborough saying, and I quote, "Refreezing the Arctic where it possible would be a huge defence against the global catastrophes currently threatened by continued global warming." And that's about as eminent as you can get. So I think the fact that the debate about climate interventions is now more diverse is important. I think the debates about Arctic interventions are easier to win because the the paths forward are less risky than sulfates. I mean, obviously, a huge amount of money should be put into researching anything and everything that can possibly work. But I can see why Sir David King has focused on the Arctic, because there is a political path forward. And as you know now, he's getting a lot of grip, politically speaking, and talking to some people with a large amount of money in Europe and America to try and make this a reality. And so I think from these points of view, the climate intervention debate is in a much healthier place than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And I'll leave it there, Herb.
Wow. Thank you so much, David. There's so much that you gave us to discuss and chew over and ask you about. I just want to make a couple very brief comments. First, since you started speaking, we've had 2 additional folks join us, Paul Zeitz and Leslie Field. And if I could ask the 2 of them just to put a sentence or 2 in the chat introducing yourself. Welcome to both of you. Secondly, I wanted to mention that I happened to catch this. I don't know if anyone else on this call did, but you spoke, David, just several weeks ago at the MEER group, MEER, and both Ye and Barbara Sneath are members of our group as well. But your video is I think available on their site if you haven't gotten enough of David today. It's a very provocative conversation as well. And I don't know if you were referring when you talked about other young Australian researchers, but at our next meeting we have Graham Taylor, who is the coordinator of the Best Futures program in Australia, and he's going to be speaking with us. And he's also a supporter of the kinds of things we're talking about today. And lastly, you mentioned Mike McCracken. Mike is a very active member of our group, and in fact, just emailed me 5 minutes before the meeting expressing his regret that he couldn't come today, but he's eager to watch the video as soon as we put it up. So with that, my first question, and then I'll turn it over to folks. In the meantime, you can put your virtual hands up if you have a question, so we can line up for that. Is, if we go back to the early 2000s and you and your colleagues, I guess, Ian Dunlap and maybe Philip and others, what was it that sort of allowed you was the incentive to basically go against much of the conventional wisdom and start putting out this information that at the time, certainly you were not the only ones, but you were among, as I mentioned at the beginning, the leaders in the world. What was the spark that led to that? And you're obviously still doing it 15 years later.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I guess I was a complete outsider. And I mean, I think often in these debates, outsiders can see things that insiders can't see. It's a classic role of an outsider. And I've been involved in a lot of other political causes and community campaigns. And I'd done bits and pieces of work for environment groups. And I'd always sort of thought that environment and climate groups were looking after my interests in terms of climate advocacy. And in 2005, when the Stern report came out, you may remember that Nicholas Stern, the UK economist, brought out a report, which was said to be important. But Stern said, well, we could have a goal of 450 parts per million or 550 parts per million, which he said was 2 or 3 degrees of warming. In fact, it's more than that with feedbacks. And he said, we should go for 2 degrees, but that would be too economically disruptive. So I think our target should be 3 degrees. He must regret saying this now. And I thought I knew enough to think, this is outrageous. This is the end of civilization. And then in one of our daily newspapers here, the CEO of the leading Australian environment group wrote an opinion piece saying what a great step forward the Stern report was. And I just got so angry, I thought, I'm going to have to sit down and start reading and understanding this. So that was the moment where the penny dropped for me that the debate was delusional and wrong. And my parents were both science teachers. And as soon as I delved into it and fortunately came across Jim Hansen really early, he was telling a very different story. And I guess Jim Hansen and James Lovelock were my sort of godfathers in terms of understanding this stuff. I realized that and Philip Sutton and Ian both added a real lot to my understanding that that 2 degrees was a really dangerous target, as it's proved to be the case. And as soon as you understand that, then the rest of the logic follows.
Yeah, thank you for that. It just strikes me that just as you and your colleagues were sort of saying the IPCC emperor has no clothes, and with respect to that, your fellow Australian, the economist Steve Keen, has punctured holes into the sort of neoclassical. I'm afraid to say anything about economics because I have my friend and colleague Ron here who will correct me, but basically, sort of said that the kinds of economic analysis that the IPCC relies on I think the word you used before would apply to that, delusional, if nothing else.
Well, I mean, there's an American economist won the Nobel Peace Prize, won a Nobel Prize for economics for his work on climate economy models, Nordhaus, 3 or 4 years ago. And what he produced is, in my mind, just totally crook. I mean, they have models which actually don't quantify climate damage in the model. So they're really just about energy prices. I mean, it was to my mind, it was a fraud from the start. And he's been lauded with a Nobel Prize. So this is the problem we have, that things have been normalized in the policy making debate, which are not grounded in reality. I mean, that's a problem that we all will have to crack through. And I mean, it's really interesting that the understanding about the fraudulent nature of what are called integrated assessment models, these models that combine the economic system, the climate system, and the energy system, is now much more advanced, and people are now knowing. And there's quite a good bit of academic literature saying integrated assessment models reflect the political and social priorities of their modelers more than they reflect reality. So I think, we are starting to move forward on that debate.
Yeah, the big question, of course, is it too late? But with that, let me turn it over to Robert Tulip. Robert, go ahead.
Look, thanks very much, David. That was superb. I feel that I have the impression that your own thinking has evolved in the last couple of years. In looking at some of the Breakthrough Institute material from a few years ago, there was a very strong emphasis on the need to accelerate emission reduction. And the Healthy Planet Action Coalition view is that we should consider emission reduction, greenhouse gas removal, and direct climate cooling as 3 equal legs to the stool. Now, my personal view is that really the missing leg is direct climate cooling, and through solar geoengineering and other technologies, and that we really need to put a major focus on constructing that leg of the stool in order to prevent tipping points and mitigate tipping points. So I'm really interested in your how you see that your thinking has changed, what you see the role of emission reduction in climate stability today is, and then I'd also be interested in the sort of governance arrangements that will be needed to pursue these questions. Thank you.
We could spend half an hour on each of these questions, couldn't we? Look, in terms of governance, I mean, I think the problem is, and Kim Stanley Robinson has this scenario in his most recent book, The Ministry for the Future, is that when things get bad enough, a lack of governance structure won't stop particular nations from acting.
Yes,
so,
but
so the argument about we can't talk about geoengineering, or we can't, think about proceeding because we don't have the governance is not a reasonable objection to doing anything, because the governance issue in the end will resolve itself if it isn't resolved by treaty. It obviously should be resolved by treaty and international agreement, but a lack of governance won't stop climate interventions going ahead. In terms of my thinking, well, obviously, I mean, for example, in 2020 and 2021, we put out 2 versions of things called Climate Reality Check, a little 20 points about the climate system, and both of them ended, with this message that we need the 3 levers and that the climate interventions are important. I mean, they're obviously more important now because the situation's got worse really quickly. I mean, I think when we wrote Climate Code Red, we made the case for climate interventions because we said what was safe was under 0.5 degrees, following Jim Hansen. That's still the case, but there was some hope back then. I remember in 2009-10, Will Steffen, the great Australian scientist who died earlier this year, was talking about the 2010s being the critical decade for emissions reduction. So there's still some hope that that could happen. Obviously, it happened. Emissions have just kept on charging up. And now, I think looking from those charts I showed, and the fact that emissions will no more than plateau this decade, that 2 degrees is not even on the political agenda in any practical way. It's not. It's obvious to all of us, and that's why you work together, is that mitigation is not going to save us from a dreadful outcome. Drawdown is absolutely important, but until you get to zero emissions, drawdown just reduces the amount of net emissions going up. And drawdown is by its nature a fairly slow systematic project. Drawdown in 2 or 3 years is not going to undo 50 years or 100 years worth of emissions. So drawdown is absolutely important, but it's a long-term strategy. And the only thing that will practically stop dreadful things happening now is climate interventions. Now, I'm not going to say climate interventions are more important than the other 2, but they're no less important than the other 2. And I think we have to say all the time, these 3 things are all necessary. I mean, it's ironic that countries are cleaning up their coal and oil supplies in order to reduce sulfates, to reduce the amount of acid rain, which obviously, destroys the lives of a lot of people. But, you'd actually be sensible to close down most coal-fired power stations in an ironic way and keep a few going that are burning really sulfate-intensive coal, because that would keep the aerosol load up. So there's all sorts of ironies in the circumstances, but absolutely all 3, but without climate interventions, whether they're global or regional, we are not going to stop things happening at a systematic level that will likely destroy human civilization, not humans, but Chatham House did a report 2 years ago. If people haven't read it, I really urge you to go and read the short version of the Chatham House Climate and Security Assessment. And they said the path we're on, if there aren't rapid emissions reductions, will mean that by 2050, there will be a 50% increase in demand for food, up to a 30% reduction in crop yields, and we can see this leading to global instability and breakdown, social breakdown and conflict. And this is the UK government's principal think tank. So, I think the idea that we're heading for failed states, a breakdown of relations between nations and regional global conflict is not on the margins anymore. It's what state analysts are now thinking.
Yet the British government continues to reject climate intervention.
Yeah.
Well, that's the contradiction, isn't it? Okay, I think, Ron, I think you were next, and then Adam.
Yes, thank you, Herb. Thank you, David. You seem very, very much on the same page as many of us here, and in fact, a similar journey and everything else. I'm a radical economist, just to be clear. I'm not at all. I'm in fact
I guess that
kind of a colleague of Steve Keen and et cetera. Other heterodox colleagues. I recently, my recent calculation of like 4.7% a year reduction in GHG just to meet the IPCC goal of staying, roughly at 1.8 or well below 2, which, is just not, we're going nowhere with that. So that's 8 years, year over year. So, we put out, anyway. So my question is, two questions really. we recently had David Keith on. I don't know if you saw the video. And David, of course, has been a leader in SAI work, and he was very reticent. I mean, so there, the issue came up as to the urgency and of the need for cooling, and particularly, and also the whether it should be done in the Arctic as a starting point. And of course, many of us are saying, wait, well, we need it right now, and well, at least low risk cooling techniques, and to roll out other higher risk techniques as rapidly as possible, possibly the Arctic, going slowly, kind of implementing gradually and measuring and assessing, which is very much, I think, Mike McCracken's also floated that idea years ago. And David was really very he seemed to have real disagreement with that on the grounds that I think it was kind of an economic, the middle latitudes, the southern hemisphere are the folks who really need the cooling the most, which of course is true. But there, he did, and of course his understanding is it would happen later after more research and so forth. Has been his position. So my question is two things. One, why, many of us, I mean, it's polar cooling is really, it's the kind of the Cornell group idea of starting with the poles, because those are the linchpins of the climate in many ways, and tipping points that would affect many other things, including many people in the mid latitudes as a starting point. So that's one question. And two, what are the risks? I keep hearing, there's always this idea that yes, we need the risk of not cooling, of course, but also even just the risk of SAI. I keep searching around for what are the risks. I looked at the Montreal Protocol report, and it was very mixed. Even for Antarctic cooling, they're focusing on what the effect on the ozone will be. It's very, very mixed. It's not at all. It does not seem like it seems like a rather moderate risk, all things considered. I'm wondering if you're aware, and that of course is for the most high leverage global technique. I mean, we have 18 other, and we could start many of them right now with no to zero risk, and we should be doing it. But even at the highest kind of leverage method that appears to be SAI, it's hard. I'm wondering if you have a good assessment of the possible risks and where we could find references for that.
I'm an investigative journalist. I'm not a scientist, so to limit to my commentary, I try to interrogate what's out there and understand it, and maybe put in a different framework. I mean, I saw a clip recently of David Keith. I don't know whether it was with your group or somebody else, saying he didn't really believe in tipping points, which I found really disturbing and wrong in principle. And I think he's really on an outlier there. So that worries me somewhat. I mean, I don't think regional non-aerosol interventions in the Arctic should be put in contradiction to SRM globally. I mean, I don't think it's an either-or question with interventions. I think the system is so desperate. We need to do everything that we can. I mean, I know during the Manhattan Project, they had what was called parallel development. You got each idea about how to make a bomb, and you let each research team do it at the same time rather than one each other, because it foreshortens the time. I mean, I think that's true here. So we've really got to look at every possibility. I mean, I think the thing about polar interventions, and I'll talk about Antarctica a little bit at the moment, is that, I mean, it's really clear already that there is a cascade of nonlinear change coming out of the Arctic. I mean, when I started reading this, I was really astounded that nobody said, if you lose the Arctic sea ice, Greenland can't be stable. And I spent years looking for it, and the only person who said it was Jim Hansen. He said, I can't imagine Greenland being stable if we lose a lot of the sea ice. And that's turned out to be the fact. But there was a reticence to talk about these links. I mean, and obviously now, you know, the Arctic's warming 4 times as fast as the rest of the system, the global system. There are a number of significant tipping points which have passed, and for the Greenland ice sheet as a whole, the pouring of non-salinated water into the North Atlantic is slowing down the Gulf Stream. And there's clear data that a slowing of the Gulf Stream affects precipitation in the eastern Amazon and leads to a certain amount of drying, perhaps a replacement with fires and so on, a replacement of rainforest with dry sclerophyll forests. I mean, there's a clear cascade of events. I mean, I think that's the sort of thing that's really preoccupying David King, because, you know, what stops in the Arctic starts in the Arctic doesn't stop there. And we've seen the destabilization of the jet stream, and how that has both produced a huge amount of heat running into the Arctic, and these incredible cold events which you've experienced in Europe and North America and elsewhere as a consequence of that. So, I mean, I think Dave King is right that trying to prevent the total loss of sea ice and its consequences for the Arctic is a really important short-term task. Interestingly, Australia is one of the Antarctic partners. There's about a quarter, a third of East Antarctica that Australia has claim over, and we have bases there. And the most vulnerable glacier in East Antarctica is called Denman Glacier, right in the middle of the Australian area. And, you know, all these Antarctic partners sign all this stuff about duty of care to protect nature, protect ecosystems. I mean, if they were consistent, you would also want to protect the glacial systems that those ecosystems depend on. And Denman is in really serious trouble. It's got the deepest trough of any glacier in the world. It slopes back from the grounding line. So if it goes, it will go really quickly. It's like a big version of Thwaites. So, I mean, I don't know whether your group has ever had John Moore come and talk to you. I did an interview with John Moore, who's been into these sort of curtains from the base of glaciers to try and stop the warm water getting under and stabilizing them. And there's a certain amount of literature. I know there's a meeting of the Antarctic partners I think in Finland in May or June. And certainly people like John Moore, who are into polar interventions, will be speaking at the Antarctic Convention. So I think that's a really important moment as well. And I know David King will be speaking there as well. The fact that partners coming together who have interest in polar regions actually having climate interventions on the agenda, I think is really, you know, a really positive thing. As the broader questions of SRM, as I said, I haven't delved in the literature enough to make a definitive judgment on where it is, but I mean, it seems to me the literature is more positive than negative. Yes, there are risks, but as I've argued, and Mike McCracken has argued, there are risks in not acting or delaying acting. And, you know, it is now clear that we're heading towards a civilizational disjuncture. And I don't think that's been in the debate. The debate has all been, oh, if we do SRM, there's this risk. Yes, there is, but the risk of not acting doesn't seem to be in the literature.
So just one follow-up. So in your view,
No, Ron, I'm sorry, Ron. We need to make sure we get through everybody's questions. If there's time, we'll come back to you. We're going to have Adam and then followed by Rebecca and Doug. Let's try to keep the questions to a minute or so, so we can get as many in before we wrap up later.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can do that because,
well, let's say 90 seconds. Go ahead.
of which 15 are gone. A couple of comments. One is that civilizations always fail, and they fail for similar reasons, and it's exceeding carrying capacity and destruction of the biosphere and our life support systems. And they fail and they collapse, and eventually something comes back and takes its place. In our case, civilization is global, so there really is not much room for that kind of failure. And part of that failure is that people run around in circles wondering what to do next, and it's very hard to focus because things around you are collapsing. And they're collapsing on an exponential curve, and it's very difficult for us to understand even at this point, to see exponential curves because they accelerate so fast. And that's been very apparent in the last 4 or 5 years. So given that, David, I find you very optimistic. And I don't suppose people say that very much, but when tipping points tip, they've tipped. They don't untip, except in a long time frame. And
Yeah.
I don't see that we've got much room to move here.
Well, I'm one of those people who tends to live by the motto, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the spirit, following Antonio Gramsci. That's just the way I am. I mean, I just think we have to be, I mean, I'm not a happy, clappy person. I mean, I find that the sort of fear and hope debate really a bit of a sidetrack, because it's not about fear or hope. It's actually about courage to face the evidence honestly and work out what we can do about it. I think on tipping points, some systems will respond fairly well with cooler conditions. Corals will respond fairly quickly because there's not much hysteresis or none. The same true of Arctic sea ice. It will recover quite quickly. Glaciers won't. So I think the response to cooling depends on the system. I mean, Jason Box makes the point that if the system stayed at 1.5 degrees, what would happen to or 1.7, what would happen to Greenland would be very different if it got to 2.5 or 3 in terms of the rate of loss and so on. So, I mean, I think there are practical things that can be done, and I think cooling interventions now will stop a lot of really bad stuff happening. I agree that past collapses have been regional, and this time it's global. A, because climate change is global, and B, we live in a globalized world, so that makes it a very different proposition. But I mean, I just think we have to look at what are the rational things that can be done that are efficacious, and just advocate for them to the best of our ability, which is, obviously why we're all on this call.
Great. Okay. I wanted to welcome 2 folks who've joined us since the last time I welcomed a couple of folks, Jonathan Cole and John McDonald. Welcome. And if you don't mind just putting a couple sentences in the chat, telling us a bit about yourself. With that, I will turn it over to Rebecca.
Hi, David. I'd like to ask a question in the Australian context that probably will help others as well. It's about the mainstream environmental movement that mobilises action. Key things like Stop Coal Now and that kind of thing. Do you see any change happening with, say, the Climate Council, which is institutional, and the ACF, which is more of a grassroots and Get Up and those types of organisations? Do you see that they are starting to understand the need for climate cooling, and, or if not, how can we reach them?
Well, I mean, I think there's sort of schematically 2 sorts of climate activism. There was the work that really, as I mentioned earlier, came out of traditional environment organisations, whether it's in Australia or elsewhere, conservation groups, turning their attention towards climate. So I mean, people like Greenpeace or the Australian Conservation Foundation, obviously similar organisations in the US, added climate to their environmental advocacy, but they did it within a nature conservation ethic, which I think is the problem, as I mentioned earlier, because the nature conservation methodology is that we should have hands-off nature and not intervene. But as I said earlier, not intervening in the climate system by cooling won't preserve it. It will destroy the things you want to preserve. And I don't think those groups have actually thought through what nature conservation means. I mean, to save the Great Barrier Reef, you need to cool the system. And they just can't bring themselves to do it because they're in an ethic and a network of people who are just really opposed to this stuff because it's interfering with nature. And I'm saying we've been interfering with nature since we started burning coal and oil. So I am not optimistic about those groups. I just think that they're a problem. On the other hand, if you look at the people who are really changing the story, whether it be Extinction Rebellion or Greta or young activists, I think there are different sort of organisations who don't have this long history of wanting to work inside government. These large institutions who think that compromising with parties in power all the time is the way forward. We've had another example of it here, which I won't bore with people with, where people were basically going for low goals, and they don't understand that you can't negotiate with the laws of physics and chemistry. You have to say what needs to be done. But I see a lot of younger activists who are much more open to the climate intervention idea. But honestly, I think, I mean, the fact that most large advocacy organisations continue to repeat the IPCC, celebrate the IPCC, don't understand the risk problems, think that going to the COP is a good idea, means that they're on the wrong side of the story now. I just think that a lot of them are just internally lost, to be honest.
Hard to disagree with that. All right, well, we have got a few more folks.
Yeah, I do want to say something. Just
wait a minute. Let me, Brian, if I could. Doug, we have Doug and then Paula and then Brian. And then I'd like to, if we have time, I'd also like to see if Paul would like to say a few words, because you put this interesting idea in the chat about a global cooling treaty. So if we're able to get Doug and Paula and Brian, and then Paul, if you're willing, maybe to wrap up with a bit of a discussion on the cooling treaty, I think that would be a great last 20 minutes or so for our session. So with that, go ahead, Doug.
Just to let you know, I've taken my hand down, so there is more time.
Okay, well, I hope you didn't take it down for any reason other than you got your question answered or whatever. But in any case, go ahead, Doug.
I'm going to frame my question and by referencing a few things that Jim Hansen has said over since 2007, 2008. He mentioned 350, no more than 350. He actually suggested 300 parts per million. In December 3rd of 2013, he suggested a 6% per annum, as Ron was suggesting earlier, reduction in emissions, and agricultural and forest soil management, mainly soil manager. I don't know if you talked about biochar then, but we haven't done any of that. And it occurred to me that in order to get the elephant out of the room, that is the trillion tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, we really need to have a new extraction industry, which is extracting greenhouse gases, and including things like Brian with his kelp farming and repopulating the whale populations to sequester carbon, and all the other different ways of mining. I'm going to say mining, extracting greenhouse gases. Here's my question. Michael Mann doesn't mention any of that. He says we just have to reduce our emissions, and within 3 or 4 years, temperature is going to start going down. And that is in direct violation of what Jim Hansen has said in his paper recently. And I see the new climate war, sorry, Mr. Mann, but the new climate war is going to be between Hansen and Mann in terms of the equilibrium or the trajectory. So I want to know, and from your perspective, how do you reconcile what Michael Mann says, reduce emissions and we're all just going to be happy?
Yes, I don't think Jim Hansen has ever, in my knowledge, been substantially wrong. I think he's a brilliant man who's just got a vision of what's going on that's unsurpassed. I mean, the debate about what will happen if you reduce emissions is sort of, well, like, what do you want to assume? I mean, there's obviously a large aerosol forcing, a temporary cooling. I mean, Jim Hansen's had this long debate with himself by having this debate between his 2 grandchildren about whether the aerosol cooling is smaller or larger, where the net aerosol cooling is, half to 3/4 of a degree, or is it a degree to a degree and a half? And we've never been able to measure it because, as he pointed out, the satellites are never put up there. I think the aerosol cooling is higher rather than lower. There's various evidence for that, including some papers a couple of years ago on ocean stratification, showing there is a stratification at the top of the ocean that's preventing the as much drawdown of heat into the deep ocean as was assumed in the models. And if the heat is not going into the ocean, then it's in the atmosphere. And if it's not showing up in the temperature, it's only because the aerosol cooling is high. Jim has made all these points. So I think the aerosol cooling is higher than orthodox science and people like Michael Mann assume. And if the aerosol cooling is high, when you reduce greenhouse emissions, you're gonna get a rapid burst of warming. So I'm a bit on the high aerosol end of the equation, which means that Jim's right. It also assumes, it depends what you assume about the more short-lived gases. I mean, a lot of models saying, well, we assume that all the short-lived gases, methane and nitrous oxide, will be reduced to zero, and that will balance out the aerosol loss. But the fact is that half the methane emissions are not easily controlled because they're out of degraded wetlands and so on, and you can't dial methane back to zero. So, I mean, my problem with all these models and scenarios is you can make whatever assumptions you want to produce the result you want. But I think that the idea that we're going to get emissions to zero and the temperature will suddenly stabilize is not right because of the aerosol problem. The second problem is that it assumes that there are no feedbacks that won't keep on driving the warming up, and it's clear now that we are in a cycle where carbon cycle feedbacks are active. So whether it's degraded, I mean, there's now significant data that the Amazon is a net source of carbon rather than a sink. Obviously, the emissions from the Arctic, from boreal forest and from permafrost are non-trivial. So even if you stop all the human emissions, there are still things that will add CO2 to the atmosphere. So I'm with Jim Hansen on that. Was there another part to the question? I can't remember, Doug.
Well,
we move on for now.
In my mind, I see there's a war between the two.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, I think it doesn't really matter because in the short term, we have to cool the Arctic.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether one is right or wrong.
Look, and I think the thing is, in the short term, the rate of warming is going to go up for the reasons I showed you in that chart, that emissions are continuing to be high, we're dropping aerosols, and the rate of warming now in the last decade is higher than any other decade. The rate of warming is sharpening.
Yeah. Okay. I want to make 3 quick points, and then I'll turn it over to Brian. First, with regard to aerosols, I don't know how many people are familiar with the work of Leon Simons, who's a Dutch member of the Club of Rome. Those of you who are on Twitter, I would urge you to follow him. He's done a lot of research on the impact of the switch to low sulfur fuel for ships in 2020 and the impact that that's having on temperature increases. He's also one of the co-authors of Jim Hansen's paper. So that's the first thing. Secondly, just very briefly, when you talked about methane, when we had David Keith, my eyebrows went up when someone asked him about methane, and he felt it was no need to even think about implementing any of these experimental techniques to suppress methane. He says, well, it falls out of the atmosphere, and he was very dismissive, which surprised me. And thirdly, in case you don't look at the chat, David, John McDonald, your fellow Australian, has sent you a note asking to have coffee with you. So take a look at that. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Just a small comment that many of the traditional NGOs are focused mainly on protecting and conserving. And of course, the animals have already left the barn. So for us to get the animals back, we're going to have to actually, work on some more good things in the seas and the soils. And for that, we're looking at restoring and regenerating kelp forest ecosystem services offshore in the seas and healthy soil microbial communities in the soils. So we've got to move beyond the passive, do nothing. We've got to actually take positive action to regenerate biodiversity and reduce nitrate and phosphate loads. as Professor Rockstrom has so aptly articulated in his discussion of planetary boundaries. So David, really want to commend you for the work and the message you're getting out, and it's great to hear about these developments.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who put this provocative idea in the chat. And if you'd like to expound on it, maybe we can have David respond and a couple of others respond. We've got a few minutes left before we wrap up at the top of the hour. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Herb. Hey, everyone. Nice to see friends. Nice to meet new people. Thanks. It's been an honor to be part of these calls for the past month or two. I've learned so much, and I feel like there's like an emerging consensus from the collective wisdom of this group, this coalition, and all the experts that have come forward that, there may be opportunity. I do political advocacy, campaigning, and movement building. I'm a physician by training, and I actually think this is about the survival of the human species. So, like, my idea is like we should try to extend it and have fun while we're doing it as well. And so we have to transform now. So the idea that I was just responding to what you said, which was like, we need a UN treaty. So in my world, what's the treaty? What does it say? What do we want it to say? What are our demands? And let's start a campaign. I think we can get that through. I do. I think there's a global awareness of this kind of stuff shifting. And I've done advocacy at the global level on global AIDS and other major issues. And I see it as possible to also, create a global multi-stakeholder partnership to bring together all this wisdom and move into research and exploration and prepare for deployment. And also, I would say we need a community. We need to build this community and work together to make this happen now. I'm convinced. I think you're all convinced. Let's go into action mode. So that's just how I see the opportunity here. And things are so bad now, based on all this analysis you're all doing, is that maybe this is the moment for humanity to take an evolutionary leap and move into optimistically solve the problems that we have before us. So that's where I'm at. Love to hear feedback.
We've
David?
been discussing a global cooling treaty in other terms within the HPAC and also the Planetary Restoration Action Group in the context of saying that governments need that an international governance framework for direct cooling is essential, and then how that would operate. So I think Paul's suggestion of calling it a global cooling treaty is really good. Sorry, Herb, back to David.
Look, governance is not an area I looked at a lot. I mean, I'm very wary of UN processes because you can see how the IPCC and the UNFCCC have just turned into absolute disasters. But certainly I think and I mean, the trouble with these processes is that people with bad intent can stuff them up within a UN framework. I mean, look at the next COP, being chaired by the chairman of one of the world's greatest gas producers. But I think people, states and NGOs of good intent getting together and trying to build this process is absolutely important. I'd just be wary of going down the official UN path, because you know where that leads. So I'm not negative at all, but it's just a question of what is the path into it.
We looked at the example of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, establishing the International Monetary Fund, and that's allied to the UN process, but still somewhat outside of the UN. And an international climate organization that was in some way distinct from the UN process is something we've been talking about.
The only effort I know at this point, and I hope there are others, to have some sort of international treaty is the so-called, if I got it right, the International Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Folks familiar with that? That an NGO in Canada has started, and they're attempting to get local governments and, anybody basically to sign on to that. But I'm not aware of any other effort like that. Is there, let me ask, is there some interest on the part of a couple of you maybe to brainstorm as to what that treaty might say and how we might, whether we should consider, we being both HPAC and our sort of colleagues at Prague and at NOAC and at Healthy Climate Alliance and others, is there anyone who would like to follow up and maybe report in the next meeting or two on some thoughts? Any volunteers on that? No? Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to volunteer.
Okay. Well, anybody want to work with Robert then? And on that, if you do, just contact Robert, I guess, or if you decide in the next couple of minutes, put your name in the chat or put your hands up. So I think it's a very intriguing idea, and we need to, we need to find, explore all sort of pathways to affect the decision-making process, none of which obviously will be easy. Are there other questions or comments that any of you would like to make? Paula, would you like to go again? I see you're off the screen, but I know you had withdrawn your question. If not, then we'll go back to Ron and give him a second chance. Go ahead, Ron. Well,
thank you. Yeah, whoops, am I getting feedback here? Anyway, that's I kind of agree with David on the, that gets to my issue of wouldn't it, do you think, David, it makes sense in terms of implementation? I get that, one thing is not contradict the other thing, or either a global or polar or whatever. We need it all. But the question was really, I just got to move it further away here. The question is really getting started, and that was sort of the way it was. I asked David Keith, as a way to start, shouldn't we just start wouldn't it be best to pilot it in the polls and ramp it up gradually from there? And I unfortunately, I think this is going to have to be done by some leading actors, because it's so extremely urgent. But this would be a way to do it without measuring it and evaluating, piloting, and then eventually getting to global if we find out that if everything works out. So that was just my follow-up from the earlier question.
Well, very briefly, I mean, my understanding is that the initiative on Arctic cooling that David King and others involved in is very much determined to get some practical on-the-ground results really quickly. It's not a theoretical exercise, it's a practical exercise. I mean, ironically, in Australia, there are some researchers who've actually had permission and started to do some very small-scale experiments on marine cloud brightening over the Great Barrier Reef. So in Australia, we have nobody knows about it, but it is actually got a small amount of government funding to look at marine cloud brightening. So, I mean, I think, feet on the ground is what's really important wherever we can to really support those initiatives who can start doing experiments and testing things, because that will, quote unquote, break the ice.
Okay. I see that Paul and Aria have agreed to work with Robert on the global cooling treaty. So I don't think it's unreasonable to set a timetable to get this adopted by the world community by what? The end of this year? By the COP? Come on, guys. All right. Well, we're going to hold you accountable. This stuff is so easy to do. My goodness. I want to ask, we got just a couple minutes before the top of the hour. We appreciate your appearing and staying as long as you have, David. But if you were the sort of a philosopher king or ruler of the earth at this point, what's the pathway that's not entirely idealistic, that has at least some element of realism, but would obviously be a stretch more than what we're doing now, to get from here to where I think we all pretty much agree, which is, an emergency scale deployment of accelerated emissions CDR, and whatever portfolio of cooling can, basically bring temperatures down and stabilize things to give us time for the other two to work. What could that look like?
Oh, that's the easy question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, recently, actually, a philosophy journal in Slovenia got me to write a piece. They had a special issue on emergency, and the article is called Reclaiming Climate Emergency. So if anybody Googles Reclaiming Climate Emergency in my name, they'll probably get a link to it. And there, I tried to answer that question a bit. I mean, if you look at emergency responses, mobilization responses, whether it's a world war, whether it's a bushfire, whether it's a pandemic, the principal feature of any emergency response is government state leadership. Government state leadership is the key to emergency mobilization. And in that article, I try to explore, and I'm going to do some more work. And I think the fatal problem is that there has been an abiding belief, and it's reflected in integrated assessment models in the COP outcomes. There is an abiding belief that the market can deal with the risks, and it can't. I mean, one of your financial analysts in the US, very onto a guy called Spencer Glendon, says this is not a question of risk, of market risk. This is the risk of capitalism ending, and I don't think that's understood. So I think there's a problem that there's a market can solve the problem when it can't. You can't quantify the risk. You can't put a dollar value on the social cost of carbon. If you put infinite numbers into models, they break down, they can't compute. So I think there's an obsession with the market, which is, reflected everywhere. And therefore an abnegation of political responsibility. Why say that abnegation? Well, in my experience, policymakers, with few exceptions, and the UN Secretary General is one exception, simply don't understand the risks. They really don't believe we're heading towards civilizational breakdown. They live in a policymaking paradigm we've tried to talk about, where they think that the carbon price and incremental action and BECS in 50 years is going to solve the problem. So I think there is a disjuncture between the reality of what's happening on the ground and the way that reality is constructed in policy making and political leadership around the world. And when you combine that sort of groupthink with an obsession with the market, which cannot calculate or respond to the risks, then you've got the sort of failure you have. So I would say it's about continuing to hammer the risks and trying to get policymakers to adopt a risk framework that actually deals with the reality of what's going on, and trying to get people to understand why the market has and will necessarily fail.
Well, thank you for that. And I basically said we'd end it now, but I realized that I forgot to ask you if you could take 1 or 2 more minutes to answer a question, at least one of the questions that one of our more active members, Robert Chris, emailed earlier. He's in Dubai and it's 2 a.m. or something, so he wasn't able to get on the call. So I'll just ask you the last question. What odds are you currently giving that cascading tipping events sufficiently serious to disrupt the global economy will not begin by 2030, 2040, and 2050, respectively? If I like these odds, where can I place my bet?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that, when we're talking about tipping points and cascades, we're talking about non-linearities, which has been the problem with the IPCC, that certain parts of the climate system can be understood and quantified and be reasonably projected, but system level changes, I mean, whether it's Arctic sea ice, whether it's Greenland, whether it's Western Antarctica, have all been underestimated in the literature for the very nature that they're not linear processes. They're subject to system dynamics. They're subject to hysteresis, so they won't come back the same way. You can't quantify these risks because they're not linear, and therefore trying to establish betting odds about non-linear, non-quantifiable processes seems to be somewhat of a contradiction in terms. I'll simply say that I think the cascades are now clearly evident. I mean, there was a paper 2 weeks ago from Australian researchers looking at the Southern Ocean, saying that they think there are changes in the circulatory system in the nature of the Southern Ocean, which is one of the drivers of the global ocean circulation, that will also help to slow down the great conveyor belts that drive out of the Antarctic. So I think those cascades are not a problem in 20, 30 or 40 or 50. I think they're a problem now.
Okay, well, I know Robert Chris said he would be watching the video, so he'll get that answer. Apologies to Robert Chris for not asking all those questions, but I think a couple of them we've touched on in the course of the conversation this morning, this afternoon, or tonight, depending upon where on this wonderful planet we live on, that we all want to keep wonderful as much as we can. So with that, I really want to thank you, David. Your commitment and your insight and your knowledge is second to none on these issues. We hope you'll stay connected with us. Maybe we can touch base with you if and when we flesh out this global cooling treaty idea. Get your input and support for it. Thank you so much, everybody.
My pleasure.